Welcome to the Second Bite podcast, where we talk with top entrepreneurs and CEOs about creating valuable companies through creative transactions. Now, let's get started with the show.
And welcome back to the Second Bite podcast. We've got John Sharkey with me today from Spinnaker. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
John, this is going to be such a great episode because I think it is a great example of how messy entrepreneurship can be, and with guidance and help and support, how you can kind of steer a path that has turned into a very successful one for you and your partners. So I'm excited to get into that. Let me thank our sponsors, the folks at Tower Partners. Tower Partners is a lower middle market investment bank in Columbia, Maryland. I am one of the partners there. They were voted best lower middle market investment bank by AXA in 2025. So thanks to them because they sponsor and help us make this podcast work. But John, I want to spend most of our time obviously talking about the very interesting career that you have had over the last half a decade or so. Can we start with Spinnaker, and what does Spinnaker do and who do you do it for?
Sure. So Spinnaker SCA is the broader company. We are a supply chain consulting company. So we do a mix of management consulting and systems implementation work focused in supply chain. So that's, supply chain planning and business planning, warehouse operations, transportation, production management, that sort of thing. And the type of clients we work with, it's really across industries, but it's everything from, some of the world's biggest apparel and retail brands to large automotive companies, big semiconductor companies, kind of if companies buy, make, or move or sell widgets, there's work we'll do with them to help them run their companies more effectively.
And when you got started, maybe that would be a great place to start, because like many, when you're trying to figure out the road forward, it gets a little bit complicated. Some people would describe it as messy. There's different personalities involved. So you started with, or our story will start with a acquisition or by Blacklake Capital. So you decided to partner with Blacklake, but you also at the same time, I think you put SPA into the mix together.
Yeah. So we
talk a little bit about how that happened.
Sure. So in the supply chain space, there's, kind of different specialties, and Spinnaker, which is the part of the company I came from, was more focused on the planning portion of supply chain. So how do you forecast demand? How do you plan production? That sort of thing. SCApath, which was the company that we merged with to create Spinnaker SCA, focused more on warehouse execution and transportation management. So kind of the more execution portion of supply chain. And we had met the founder and basically decided to take the two businesses together to market, and, met the Blacklake team, and, basically ultimately used that acquisition to essentially, facilitate the merger of those two companies.
And so I want to talk about selecting Blacklake as your partner. But before that, did you guys identify SPA? Did you know each other? Did you try to merge and just needed cash to make that work? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we, it was one of those situations where each of the businesses had, a bunch of partners involved, and, essentially some of the legacy partners in Spinnaker, the two of the original founders, were ready to exit the business and go move on and do other things. So we were looking for, a financial transaction to buy them out of the business. And then Evan, who was the founder of Blacklake, of SCApath, was focused on, he wanted to basically take some chips off the board. So he stayed, as an investor in Spinnaker SCA after we put the business together, but he took some money out as part of that transaction. So we had met Evan. Both companies were based in Denver at the time, so it's kind of a a small world sort of thing where everybody knows each other. And as we got to know each other, we had really similar customers, CIOs and COOs within companies, but we did very complementary things. So we felt like, kind of a good set of businesses to put together through a merger.
So somebody said, hey, we should put these businesses together. And then a couple guys said, that would work for me because I want cash and I want to leave. Yep. And this was kind of, you viewed it as an opportunity to find a good partner and then for you to become the driving force of the business.
Yeah. So when we merged, so Evan was the CEO, I was the COO. I took over as CEO about a year into what ended up being a 3-year journey, being private equity owned. And yeah, we saw it as kind of private equity as a good route to sort of partner with to go through that type of journey.
And so there's always this challenge of how do you kind of organize or negotiate a deal, not knowing what the private equity guys might want? Did you bring both pieces and start to shop that around and say, what do you guys think you could do with these two?
We did. Yeah, we shopped the two businesses together.
For a sec, you put them together, or you said, here's how they would go together?
We said, here's how they would go together.
Okay, but they were separate and everybody knew that.
But they were separate and everybody knew that. And then they knew that it was, it was going to be, sort of like technically two separate transactions that were tethered and then purchased into the same entity on the other side. And it was there were some benefits in terms of like customer concentration. It was a little bit diluted. The SCApath had one really, really large company or customer. And so, the investors liked the idea of basically, kind of a little bit more diversification with the two businesses put together.
Gotcha. And so for you were at Spinnaker, you were a minority partner at Spinnaker?
I was a minority partner at Spinnaker. And then we had some other businesses within the Spinnaker portfolio. We sold off, one of those businesses at the same time that we did the merger with SCApath. And so I actually took money out of that transaction and put it back into this transaction.
Got it. And were there many people? So you started going around, making the rounds, talking to private equity groups. Were there a lot of them that said too complicated for a company of this size? Let's pass. And can you give us a rough idea on what the size of that business was, the combined?
Yeah, it was when we did the merger, it was 20 million or so in revenue between the two different companies. We, for sure, having done some other M&A deals both before and since, right? There's a certain size deal that's interesting to different types of companies, and I would say sort of the larger banks and the larger investors, we were probably still too small, right, to kind of get on the radar screen for a bunch of those deals. But and personally, I was actually fairly surprised just how robust the market was, though, for professional services companies. So we found a handful of different options, and it ended up being, it was Blacklake Capital plus a partner of theirs called Source Capital in Atlanta that helped us ultimately get the deal done.
And that deal was in 2021, so it was right before COVID?
It was right in the middle of it. So
it was in the middle of COVID.
Yeah. So, I mean, interesting times where, supply chain became definitely a buzzword. So there was definitely some, positive timing to this. We had parts of the business where people weren't traveling and you could work from home and, you're working with people in a corporate office. And then we had, some consultants that were on the road in warehouses every week, almost all the way during COVID, helping, businesses that were sort of booming as that was occurring. So it was very much an interesting time.
And then so Blacklake is in Denver,
right?
Did you have a lot of interest from the market? And then how did you wind up selecting Blacklake as your partner? What stood out with them?
I think we had, we in the end seriously talked to 3 or 4 different options. Everything from more strategic buyers who might have thought about bringing us into, a larger company that did similar things. But the the ones we really kind of focused on, probably the final three, were all PE options. And I think the factors ultimately that sort of made us most interested in Blacklake was, it was a fair transaction on the financial side, but also, one that we felt very comfortable with, sort of the personalities and the, kind of the vision for working with a professional services company. They had other professional services companies in their portfolio, so they knew that business. They understood kind of, people and products and kind of how do you go sell services and kind of some of the ups and downs that you would see. So it was a mix of, I would say operational passion on their side, and then also on the source capital side, that, made us most comfortable with them in the end.
I think I see that a lot, where it's never just the economics that drives a choice that way.
For sure. Yeah.
I would assume that Blacklake was at about the same valuation as the others were. Is that?
Yeah, it was not a meaningful difference where, there were some that was like marginally higher, but it was kind of all in the same ballpark, plus or minus.
And so then on day one post close, you've got all this drawn up, right? And
Yep.
on paper, it always makes a lot of sense. How do you start to execute on the thesis? Because it falls to you to do it now as a CEO, correct?
Yeah, it was pretty, it was an interesting mix of, the different customers that we worked with. So everybody had their same portfolio of different customers. And to be honest, it was a pretty easy sell to the team, because, there was a little bit of overlap where people kind of understood, the other company. They knew the culture. They knew that we did things that were very complementary. So people's lanes were, I would say, pretty well defined. And it was, a matter of, obviously there was like back office, merge the finances and all of that. And that took us probably 6 to 8 months. We didn't really rush it. Put in a new ERP system, those type of things. But the real focus, I'd say, on day one was kind of on merging go to market. So, get your website up and go talk to customers about kind of the potential of, bringing these two different sets of services. And the people, I think, ultimately kind of felt like we were continuing to march on the same type of vision, that we had going into it. So the people, it frankly made a lot of sense. And so they were excited about the new opportunity.
So one thing I'm curious about, before Spinnaker, you came from Procter & Gamble, right?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Long time ago. But
yeah.
P&G is known for its rigor. You're an MIT guy. How has your thinking or your management style changed over the years to everything has to fit in a box, that fits in a cell, that fits on a spreadsheet, to understanding human emotions and motivation? And what's that journey been like?
Oh, I always say, kind of, for the type of work we do, the challenges that we come across, and this is our client work, but I always say it's change management and it's data. Those are where projects that we do with clients go off the rails. And in some ways, it's kind of the same thing internally, right? It's how do we make sure that there's a really good kind of vision for what we're trying to go achieve, keep people excited about that vision. And then on the data side of things, it's, be pretty rigorous on kind of the blocking and tackling and ticking and tying the financials. And I would say, heading into the private equity space, I was actually really surprised just how focused the investors were on the people. And it's sort of obvious that it's a people business, and people can walk out the door and, there's, maybe some restrictions at different levels, but people aren't forced to show up and go to work and be motivated every day. And the investors were actually really, really focused on that part of it. And, where were people spending their time and getting to know the different team members? We have a pretty senior kind of leadership team. And so, we had I would say a larger leadership team. Probably 80% of the management team came from the Spinnaker side and 20% from SCA, but kind of, facilitating the bonding and getting everyone sort of, rowing in the same direction and working on the same team was a big focus actually for the investors, more than I probably would have thought going into it.
Did you always think of them as investors? Did you think of them as partners or management partners, or did you guys define lanes pretty clearly and Blacklake said, here's what we'll do and here's what you'll do?
Yeah, they were, I would say it was a pretty effective operational board, when it was ultimately put together. So we had, kind of monthly board meetings, and we would run through the details of the business. We had, right after the deal closed, we grew pretty significantly. We had a little bit of a dip, I'd say, around the beginning of year 2. And so, the level of interest, I would say, spiked up a little bit, and they were focusing on some of the details and making sure we were managing the business. And then we caught a pretty good a pretty good wins behind us, and kind of the rest of year 2 and year 3, it kind of grew pretty quickly. So
yeah, so that was another question, because that acquisition with Blacklake happened in 21, and then you exited Blacklake in 24. So it was just 3 years later. Did you do any additional acquisitions during that period of time?
We did, actually. So I talked about our business with, business consulting and systems implementation consulting. And so in these niches in supply chain, there's supply chain planning vendors and warehouse management technology vendors. And kind of our strategy was to cover, the top 3 or 4 technology vendors in those different areas of supply chain. And in the warehouse management space, we had the leader covered, or one of the 2 big leaders kind of covered really well, but we didn't have any services in this other area for a vendor called Blue Yonder. And so we did do and this was something for sure the investors, drove and facilitated, but we did a tuck-in acquisition of a company called AXA Logix right around just inside of 2 years after we put the 2 companies together.
Who took the lead on identifying candidates for acquisition? Was it you, or was it Blacklake?
So that was an area where Blacklake was really, pretty active, and they had a network of, deal sourcing companies that they had worked with and some of those type of things. So we had some buy side bankers who were out looking for target companies, and every week we would have a list and sit there and go through that list, and they'd reach out to the owners on the other side, and we found one that ended up being a really good kind of puzzle piece to go put with Spinnaker. And so it was something we supported as the management team and we're pretty excited about, but it was very much driven by Blacklake and that team.
And when you say you went through the list, you identified, here's the company, here's the capability set, and you would say, like that, don't like that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, these guys are a fit, these guys aren't a fit.
And then they would start outreach.
Yeah, and then they would go do the outreach and, see if there was interest on the other side, and then, kind of start to facilitate the process. And then Blacklake kind of stepped in and helped, kind of it wasn't a large transaction, but get the deal kind of over the finish line.
And so how did you, excuse me, what was the process like? Once you've identified that one, did you interact with them a lot, all kind of through the Q of E and the due diligence process?
We did, yeah. And it was a situation where the founder of the company, the consulting company we acquired, he had a consulting business and he had a software business. And he had founded the consulting business first, but he really wanted to go spend his energy on the software business. And so he was very, very focused on, are his people going to go land in a place that he's going to feel, proud that they're going to thrive and have a good chance to succeed and everything else. So we, for sure, I established a pretty good relationship with him, just kind of talking through his concerns, that similar to like our deal, stretched well beyond the financial side of things.
Sure. And so you were roughly 20 when you did the transaction with Blacklake. 3 years later, you decided as a group, we're going to go through a process. How big were you then?
So ultimately, like the year we sold, we had tripled our revenue, which is
we gone from 20 to 60 in 3 years.
Like a ton of, yeah. I mean, we were a little less than 20, a little less than 60, but I mean, yeah, we had, that's a ton of growth for
it's a ton of growth, but how much of it actually came from the acquisition? How much came from cross-sell and organic? 10%
came from the acquisition. Yeah, it was kind of just a puzzle piece in the end, but it was mostly, kind of cross-sell, organic growth, executing on a strategy we've been going after for a long time. And then, I think that there's definitely something to be said for like, you go from a couple of $10 million companies to a $20 million company, suddenly you're a $30 million company, and you sort of get a little bit of momentum behind you, and it starts to grow from there.
So if you compare the process that you went through as let's call it a 20 versus a 60, what are the 2 or 3 biggest differences in that process that when you look back and reflect on it?
I mean, I think the level of time and due diligence that the acquirer put into the process was pretty wildly different the second go around, right? I mean, the first go around, it was, we did Q of E's, we could sit around the table and sort of dive into things, but you could kind of understand the business, in a couple hours, you could have a pretty good grasp for what this business was. And then you go talk to customers and people in the market and make sure it's valid. The second go around, it was a process where I think we had, 15 IOIs. And then you're sort of going through down select into like, who are you going to go meet with? And, kind of focus on in a few finalists. And, and the big 4 firms doing the audits and, all of those type of things, which was not the case the first go around. So it was just a very thorough process, which I think is, kind of getting acquired by a $16 billion euro company at that point. Like they have a certain way they're going to go do things. And if it's, not a big enough deal, they're just not going to be interested, right?
Sure. And we're speaking roughly 2 years post-close, and you're still on board. How much do you think the economics of the deal impacted the ultimate choice? Because you're, again, a minority and you've got investors and they're investing for a return. Does the highest bid typically get it in that circumstance?
I was in a fortunate situation where I felt like the kind of the best option and the best economic option lined up. So it all kind of worked out, in the end. But as we were working our way through the process and the negotiations and some other, that part of it, there was times, I guess I would say, where it could have been close and could have gone, different ways. And I think ultimately, especially as a CEO and going into, from a relatively small company to a much bigger company in a people business, you've got to be able to go convince the team that this is going to be really exciting and a good opportunity, because these people, the people that work with us have a lot of opportunities out there. And so,
yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And we can kind of wrap up on this. The skill set to driving a $20 million business is certainly different than a global public company that you're part of today.
Yep.
What kind of skills are more important at this stage in your career than they were just 5 years ago?
I think the thing that I've seen is the selling motion is different in terms of, as a smaller company, the people in the room can go sell based on relationships and personality and, kind of individual expertise, at least in the business that we're in. As part of a much, much bigger company, there's many, many, many people out selling kind of on our behalf or dealing with client relationships around the world. And so there's a need to, transition from sort of network-based sales to more productized services that you can go explain to somebody who's not an expert in our field and have them, get the clients excited about it to go drive the next meeting and that sort of thing. So the selling motion is pretty significantly different, at least for a business like ours, as part of a big multinational company.
And here's my last question, because there's a lot of folks listening that are still considering their first bite, that hopefully, because your second bite was a very successful one. In hindsight, what advice would you give folks as they're considering who to select as their partner for the first bite to set them up for a successful second bite opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trust-based part of it, and working with people that do understand the vision for the company, they're excited about the company. They're obviously looking for a financial return, which we were all pretty well aligned from that perspective. But getting to a point where there's a lot of trust, I think it's at least the way I experienced the process, that was really critical. I mean, we still were planning to get together with the PE guys, and the other founder and I are going to get together in the next month or so and go play a round of golf, because we like doing that while we were all together.
Right.
And so I think I think it's just trust in the end was probably the biggest part for us.
Well, you certainly have had a successful run with Spinnaker. It's great to hear the story, and appreciate you making time to share that with us. I thank the people at Tower Partners for their sponsorship, and perhaps after you have your final exit from where you are now, we'll have you back again. But John Sharkey, thank you so much for spending some time and sharing the story of Spinnaker.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Tom.
Thanks for listening to the Second Bite podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.